The war was not misunderstood. That framing, which has survived for decades in documentaries and memoirs and congressional testimony, assumes there was something genuine to misunderstand in the first place. It assumes that somewhere inside the machinery of American military policy, there existed a coherent version of the truth that simply failed to reach the public. But the machinery did not malfunction. It functioned exactly as it was designed to function. It produced numbers. It produced language. It produced a continuous stream of optimistic assessments that bore almost no resemblance to what soldiers were experiencing on the ground, and the men who wrote those assessments knew it. They wrote them anyway. The gap between what the reports said and what the war actually was did not develop gradually over years of escalating confusion. It was present from the beginning, built into the architecture of how the conflict was measured, explained, and sold to the American people and to the soldiers being sent to fight it. This is about what the reports did not say. Not because the information was lost or overlooked, but because including it would have undermined the only metric the war ever truly had, which was the appearance of progress. The men who served in Vietnam lived inside a reality that the official record was specifically structured to exclude. What they experienced was real. What they came home knowing was real. What they tried to explain to people who had not been there was real. None of it made it into the documents that shaped policy, and most of it never made it into the history that came afterward either. There is a particular quality to the silence that surrounds what actually happened in Vietnam. It is not the silence of shame exactly, though shame is part of it. It is the silence of institutional self-preservation, the kind that accumulates in layers over decades until the original reality becomes nearly inaccessible even to people who want to find it. The soldiers who were there carried their version of events home inside them and discovered that there was no official place to put it. The reports said one thing. The men who had written the reports knew they were wrong. The men who had read the reports and sent more troops knew they were wrong. And the war continued anyway, not because anyone believed it could be won, but because stopping it required admitting what it had already cost. To understand what the reports excluded, you have to understand what the reports were actually measuring. The central metric of the Vietnam War, the one that drove strategy and shaped briefings and determined career advancement for officers across the entire theater of operations, was the body count, the number of enemy dead per engagement, per week, per month, per year. This number became the primary evidence of success because it was the only thing that could be counted with any consistency, and because the traditional markers of progress in conventional warfare, territory gained, strategic objectives secured, enemy forces rendered combat ineffective, simply did not apply in a conflict that had no front lines, no fixed objectives, and an enemy that could absorb losses and reconstitute far faster than American commanders anticipated. The body count was not invented as a cynical lie. It began as a genuine attempt to measure something in a war that resisted measurement. But within a relatively short period after American combat forces arrived in significant numbers in 1965, the body count had become something else entirely. It had become a performance. Officers understood that their evaluations, their promotions, their entire professional futures within the military hierarchy depended on producing numbers that demonstrated progress. Platoon leaders understood that their company commanders needed high counts. Company commanders understood that their battalion commanders needed them. The pressure moved downward through every level of command, and at the bottom of that pressure were the men who were actually doing the fighting, being asked to count bodies in ways that had almost nothing to do with military reality. The inflation of body counts was not a secret. It was widely understood throughout the American military in Vietnam. Soldiers spoke about it openly among themselves. Some officers protested it through internal channels, wrote formal objections, requested clarification about what exactly was supposed to be counted and why. Those objections rarely changed anything. The system had developed its own momentum. The numbers were what Washington wanted. The numbers were what MACV, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, was organized to produce. And so the numbers were produced regardless of what they actually represented. What they actually represented was often something far more troubling than inflated enemy casualties. The body count included civilians. This was not an aberration or an occasional error. It was a systemic feature of how the war was fought, and it was a feature that the official reporting structure was specifically designed to obscure. In areas designated as free fire zones, any Vietnamese person who was killed could be, and frequently was counted, as an enemy combatant. The designation of a person as a combatant happened after the fact, as a function of the counting process, not as a result of any determination made before or during an engagement. A farmer who was killed in an airstrike on a village designated as a free fire zone became, in the official record, a Viet Cong combatant. The family members who died alongside that farmer became enemy dead. The act of killing created the classification, not the other way around. This was understood at every level. Soldiers in the field knew who they were killing. They knew when an engagement involved armed fighters and when it involved people who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Many of them carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. None of it appeared in the reports. The reports showed enemy body counts climbing steadily, demonstrating progress, demonstrating the effectiveness of American firepower, demonstrating that the strategy of attrition was working. Back in Washington, analysts and planners and politicians read those numbers and made decisions that sent more men, more equipment, more bombs, and more of the same strategy that was producing numbers disconnected from any reality that mattered. The strategy of attrition itself was built on an assumption that was never seriously examined, which was that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had a breaking point, that if enough of their fighters were killed, if their losses exceeded their capacity to replace them, the war would eventually become untenable for them, and they would stop fighting. This assumption was wrong, and there is considerable evidence that military analysts knew it was wrong relatively early in the escalation. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong demonstrated throughout the war a capacity to absorb losses that American planners had not adequately prepared for, partly because the political and ideological dimensions of the conflict had not been seriously integrated into the strategic framework. The enemy was not fighting for the same reasons American forces were fighting, and they were not calculating the cost of the war in the same terms. General Vo Nguyen Giap, who commanded North Vietnamese forces, had been fighting Western military powers since before American involvement became significant. He had fought the French for nearly a decade. He understood attrition warfare from the perspective of the party absorbing the losses, and he had concluded that the side with the greater willingness to accept casualties over time would eventually prevail, regardless of which side was inflicting more damage in any given engagement. This analysis was not a secret. It was available in translated documents, in intelligence assessments, in the reports of journalists who had covered the earlier French conflict. It was part of the public record. It did not substantially alter American strategic thinking, because altering American strategic thinking would have required admitting that the entire framework for fighting the war was built on a false premise. The soldiers who were doing the fighting encountered this reality in a more immediate and visceral form than any analyst ever would. They fought over the same ground repeatedly. They took a hill, held it for a period, took casualties defending it, and then abandoned it when the tactical situation shifted, only to return months later and fight for the same hill again, against forces that had reoccupied it in the interval. This happened across the country throughout the war. Soldiers called it the revolving door. They used other terms too, most of them unprintable. The experience of fighting for a piece of terrain with no strategic significance, losing friends in that fight, and then walking away from it and watching it revert to enemy control was profoundly corrosive to morale in ways that no official report ever adequately captured. The official reports described morale as high, or in later years when the deterioration had become impossible to ignore, as adequate, as satisfactory, as consistent with operational requirements. The language of morale assessment in official military reports is a language designed to avoid saying what was actually happening. What was actually happening beginning in the late 1960s and accelerating dramatically after 1969, was a comprehensive breakdown of unit cohesion, discipline, and willingness to fight that represents one of the most significant and least discussed institutional crises in the history of the American military. Fragging was the term for it when it became lethal. The killing or attempted killing of officers by their own enlisted men, usually with fragmentation grenades thrown into quarters at night, gave the phenomenon its name. The number of confirmed fragging incidents in Vietnam is difficult to establish precisely because the reporting mechanisms for such incidents were themselves subject to the same pressures that distorted all other reporting from the war. The military had strong institutional reasons not to document the scale of the problem. Official figures from the Department of Defense acknowledge approximately 900 fragging incidents, resulting in 86 deaths during the period from 1969 to 1972. Most researchers who have examined the available evidence believe those numbers substantially undercount the actual scale of the problem. Some estimates place the actual number of officer deaths attributable to enlisted men in the thousands when you include incidents that were reported as enemy action or accidents. The fragging phenomenon did not emerge from nowhere. It was the end point of a progression that began with the breakdown of trust between enlisted men and their officers, was accelerated by the rotation system that cycled individual soldiers through 12-month tours without regard for unit cohesion, and was given its particular character by the widespread understanding among soldiers that the war they were fighting served no discernible purpose, and that their deaths would be counted as statistics in a system that had already decided what the statistics would show. Officers who insisted on aggressive patrolling in the final years of the war, after the majority of their men had concluded that risking death in Vietnam was pointless, were perceived not as leaders doing their duty, but as obstacles to survival. The grenades that killed them were, in the moral framework of the men who threw them, an act of self-preservation. None of this appears in the official narrative of the war in any coherent form. The fragging incidents that were acknowledged are treated as isolated events, individual breakdowns of discipline rather than symptoms of a systemic collapse. The systemic collapse itself, which was visible to anyone paying attention by 1969 and catastrophic by 1971, is described in official documents using language that consistently localizes the problem, attributes it to individual bad actors or specific units, and avoids any analysis that would implicate the broader institutional structure of how the war was fought and why. The drug use that became epidemic in the American military in Vietnam is similarly documented in ways that obscure what it actually represented. The official position for much of the war was that drug use was a relatively minor problem, manageable through disciplinary measures confined primarily to rear echelon personnel who were not in direct combat. This was false. Drug use was widespread across all elements of the American military in Vietnam, including frontline combat units, and it was widespread because the conditions that produced it were themselves widespread. The combination of extreme stress, meaningless attrition, the ever-present possibility of death, the complete absence of any coherent explanation for why any of it was necessary, and the abundant availability of cheap, high-quality heroin and marijuana created conditions in which drug use was not a failure of individual character, but a rational response to an irrational situation. Heroin was available throughout Vietnam at a fraction of the cost it would have commanded on the street in American cities. It was sold openly in many areas. There were periods when a substantial percentage of American soldiers in Vietnam were using heroin regularly. The number that appears most frequently in assessments of the late war period is roughly 1 in 5, though some estimates are considerably higher. The institutional response to this reality was primarily a public relations response. Amnesty programs, treatment facilities, statements from commanders expressing concern, all of which acknowledged the existence of the problem in ways carefully calibrated to suggest it was being addressed without addressing the conditions that had produced it. What produced it was the war itself, specifically the version of the war that soldiers were actually experiencing, rather than the version described in the official reports. The official reports described a war in which American forces were consistently achieving their objectives, in which progress was steady if sometimes slow, in which the sacrifices being made were rational investments in a goal that remained achievable. The war that soldiers were experiencing was a war in which the objectives changed constantly, in which progress evaporated as soon as it was achieved, in which the sacrifices accumulated without any corresponding change in the strategic situation, and in which the explanation for why they were there became progressively harder to articulate as the months passed. The soldiers who were most psychologically damaged by Vietnam were often not the ones who had experienced the most direct combat. They were frequently the ones who had thought most carefully about what they were doing and why. Men who were capable of sitting with the question of purpose and finding no adequate answer. Men who watched the body counts get reported up the chain and understood what those numbers actually represented. Men who saw the official communiques describing situations they had personally witnessed and recognized that the communiques bore no relationship to reality. The cognitive dissonance of knowing what you know and being part of an institution that officially does not know it is a particular kind of psychological damage, and it left marks that were different from the marks left by combat stress alone. The Phoenix program represents one of the most concentrated examples of the gap between official description and operational reality in the entire war. Established formally in 1968 but built on earlier programs, Phoenix was a joint American and South Vietnamese effort to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, meaning the political and organizational apparatus that supported the guerrilla movement in the South. In concept, neutralization meant capture or defection or, as an acknowledged last resort, killing. In practice, the program became something considerably different from what its official documentation describes. The incentive structure of Phoenix created the same distortions that afflicted the body count elsewhere in the war. Provincial reconnaissance units, the Vietnamese paramilitary teams that carried out most of the program's operations, were measured by their neutralization numbers. The pressure to produce numbers was intense. The result was a program that, in many areas, functioned less as an intelligence-driven counterinsurgency effort and more as a systematic campaign of assassination that frequently targeted people with no meaningful connection to the Viet Cong. The official figures for Phoenix neutralizations through the end of the program in 1972 show approximately 81,000 people captured, more than 22,000 defecting, and approximately 26,000 killed. These numbers, like virtually all numbers produced by the war's reporting machinery, are widely believed to substantially misrepresent what actually happened. The people killed under Phoenix included Viet Cong infrastructure members, South Vietnamese civilians with personal or business disputes that their neighbors used the program to settle, people who had been identified as Viet Cong based on coerced testimony under torture, and people who were killed simply because they happened to be present when an operation was conducted, and whose deaths could be attributed to the program to meet a quota. The torture component of Phoenix, which was extensive and documented by American advisors who witnessed it firsthand, appears in the official record as an acknowledged problem that was repeatedly addressed through training and supervision. In practice, it was a standard operating feature of how the program functioned. William Colby, who directed the Phoenix program as a CIA officer before eventually becoming CIA director, testified before Congress in 1971 and described Phoenix as a proper program. He defended the kill figures by distinguishing them from assassination, using language that carefully preserved the legal and institutional framework, while acknowledging numbers that implied systematic killing on a significant scale. The men who actually ran operations in the field used simpler language when they spoke privately. Some of them described it years later as what it was, a program that produced bodies, and called them Viet Cong, because the program needed bodies to justify its existence. The South Vietnamese government's own conduct during the war is another dimension of the conflict that the official American reporting systematically minimized. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN, was described in official assessments as a fighting force of variable but generally improving quality, whose capacity to take over primary responsibility for the war was the central premise of Vietnamization. In practice, ARVN units varied enormously in their effectiveness, with some units fighting with genuine commitment and others functioning as virtually no military force at all. The assessment of ARVN quality that American commanders provided depended heavily on what those commanders were trying to accomplish politically at the moment of assessment. When American forces needed South Vietnamese support, ARVN was described as a capable partner. When American commanders wanted to justify continued American involvement, ARVN was described as not yet ready to operate independently. The Saigon government itself, through multiple administrations, was characterized in official American statements as a legitimate democratic entity that represented the South Vietnamese people's desire for self-determination. The reality was considerably more complicated. The South Vietnamese government was characterized throughout its existence by deep corruption, political instability, and a narrow social base that had severe difficulty generating the kind of popular legitimacy that might have enabled it to compete with the Viet Cong's political infrastructure for the allegiance of the rural population. American officials understood this. The internal cables and assessments that have been declassified over the decades describe the Saigon government with a frankness that the public statements of those same officials never approached. The public statements were about maintaining the political narrative. The internal assessments were about trying to understand why the political narrative kept failing to correspond to anything on the ground. The relationship between American forces and the South Vietnamese civilian population is another area where the official record and the lived experience diverge substantially. The official framework described American forces as protecting the South Vietnamese people from communist aggression and winning their allegiance through a combination of military security and civic assistance programs. The actual texture of the relationship between American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians was frequently characterized by mutual incomprehension, fear, and violence that could not be contained within the official framework without making the entire project of the war incoherent. The search and destroy missions that form the tactical core of American strategy during the Westmoreland years required soldiers to move through the Vietnamese countryside, treating the civilian population with a fundamental ambiguity. Everyone was a potential enemy. The old woman in the rice paddy might be a farmer. She might be someone who told the Viet Cong where the patrol was going. She might be carrying a concealed weapon. There was no reliable way to know. And the cumulative stress of operating in an environment where every civilian interaction carried potential lethal risk produced behavioral patterns in American soldiers that were predictable consequences of the strategic situation, but that the strategic framework was not designed to acknowledge. The killing of civilians that occurred throughout the war at levels far beyond what the official record acknowledges was not primarily a product of individual soldiers with aberrant psychology. It was a product of the strategic environment, the tactical requirements, the rules of engagement that created free fire zones and designated certain geographic areas as places where killing anyone present was presumptively legitimate. The soldiers who did the killing understood, at varying levels of consciousness, that what they were doing existed in a moral and legal gray area that the official framework was not equipped to process. Most of them processed it in silence. Some of them could not. My lie is the incident that breached the silence briefly and incompletely. The massacre of several hundred unarmed Vietnamese civilians in March 1968 by American soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment was reported up the chain of command as a significant military success. A body count in the hundreds, with only one American wounded in action, the accidental discharge of a weapon. The cover-up that followed involved multiple levels of command, from the platoon level through the brigade level, and it was substantially successful for more than a year. The actual nature of what had happened at My Lai became public knowledge only in late 1969, when journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story based on information from Ron Ridenour, a former soldier who had not personally participated in the massacre but had gathered detailed accounts from those who had, and sent letters to Congress and the Pentagon that had been ignored for months. The official investigation that followed, the Peers Commission, documented not only the massacre itself, but the systematic cover-up, and found evidence of failures at multiple levels of command. The criminal prosecutions that resulted were almost entirely unsuccessful. Of the many soldiers and officers who were charged, only Lieutenant William Calley was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison, had his sentence reduced multiple times, and was released in 1974 after serving approximately 3.5 years under house arrest. The message transmitted by the outcome of the prosecution was not subtle. The institutional structure that had produced My Lai, that had created the conditions in which it occurred and then attempted to conceal it, emerged from the process essentially intact. What My Lai also revealed, though this dimension received far less attention, was that it was not an isolated incident. The Peers Commission report itself acknowledged that My Lai was part of a broader pattern of violations of the laws of war, and numerous veterans testified subsequently about incidents that shared its basic character, if not its specific scale. The Tiger Force Platoon, an elite unit of the 101st Airborne Division, conducted a 7-month campaign in 1967 that included the killing of civilians, the mutilation of bodies, and other violations that were investigated internally and then effectively buried. The investigation's findings were never made public. No one was ever charged. The Toledo Blade won a Pulitzer Prize in 2003 for reporting on the Tiger Force atrocities, 36 years after they occurred. The suppression of information about civilian casualties and war crimes was not primarily a product of individual decisions to cover up specific incidents. It was a systemic feature of how the war was managed and reported. The reporting structure rewarded body counts and punished bad news. Officers who reported incidents that reflected poorly on the war effort learned quickly what happened to their careers. Officers who produced good numbers, regardless of what those numbers actually represented, were promoted and praised and given commands. The system selected for a particular kind of institutional blindness, and it got what it selected for. The role of the press in relation to this system is more complicated than either the military's subsequent narrative or the press's own self-congratulatory account would suggest. The early coverage of the war by journalists like David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan was genuinely adversarial to the official narrative in ways that earned those journalists the personal hostility of both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. The Kennedy administration at various points tried to have Halberstam removed from Vietnam for his accurate reporting on the failures of the Diem government and the ineffectiveness of South Vietnamese military operations. But the adversarial relationship between the press and the military in Vietnam was also never complete, never systematic, and frequently broke down in ways that allowed the official narrative to survive scrutiny it should not have survived. The pool of journalists who were covering the war at any given moment was large and varied in ways that made uniform skepticism toward official briefings impossible. New correspondents arrived without context and were dependent on official sources for basic situational awareness. The daily briefings from MACV in Saigon, which journalists had labeled the 5 o'clock follies because of the gap between what was briefed and what reporters had observed in the field, were nonetheless attended and their content transmitted to American audiences because they provided the structured information around which coverage could be organized. The picture that reached American living rooms was never purely the military's picture, but it was never purely the reality either. It was a negotiated product, and the negotiation consistently favored the official version in certain areas while allowing challenge in others. The areas that were most consistently protected from serious journalistic scrutiny were the areas that would have most directly undermined the basic legitimacy of the war, specifically the systematic civilian casualties, the torture conducted by American and South Vietnamese forces, the fabrication and inflation of enemy body counts, and the evidence that accumulated through the late 1960s that the South Vietnamese government was not and could not be made into the kind of political entity that could sustain itself against the Viet Cong's political infrastructure. These were the areas where the gap between the official narrative and the reality was most extreme, and these were the areas where that gap was most successfully maintained. The Pentagon Papers, the internal history of the war commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and leaked to the press by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971, provided the most systematic public documentation of the gap between official statements and internal assessments. The paper showed that administrations going back to Truman had consistently told the public something different from what they knew internally about the situation in Vietnam. They showed that the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which had provided the legislative authorization for massive escalation of American involvement, had been misrepresented to Congress in ways that were known to be misrepresentations at the time. They showed that military commanders had consistently reported optimism upward through the chain of command, while expressing privately that the situation was deteriorating. The Nixon administration's response to the publication of the Pentagon Papers was to seek an injunction preventing further publication, an action the Supreme Court rejected. But the deeper significance of the papers was not primarily legal. It was what they revealed about the relationship between American governments and the American public on the subject of Vietnam, which was a relationship organized around the systematic provision of false information. The papers demonstrated that the misrepresentation was not a feature of one administration, but of the institutional apparatus that managed the war across multiple administrations, and that the misrepresentation was not a failure of communication, but a deliberate choice made repeatedly by people who knew what the truth was. McNamara himself, the man who had commissioned the Pentagon Papers and whose tenure as Secretary of Defense coincided with the most dramatic escalation of the war, spent the following decades processing publicly what he had known and done. His 1995 memoir acknowledged that he and others in the Johnson administration had been wrong about Vietnam in ways that mattered enormously. The acknowledgement was specific in places and carefully limited in others. He acknowledged strategic errors. He acknowledged that the internal doubts that had accumulated by 1966 or 1967 had not been acted on with sufficient urgency. He did not fully account for the degree to which those doubts had been actively suppressed in public and in the policy process while the war continued and the casualties mounted. The soldiers who came home from Vietnam encountered a civilian population that had itself been shaped by the official narrative and its gradual breakdown. The early veterans who returned in the mid-1960s encountered a public that was broadly supportive of the war and had not yet begun to process the information that would eventually reshape public opinion. The veterans who returned in the late 1960s and early 1970s encountered a public that was increasingly divided and increasingly exposed to images and information that the official narrative had not prepared them for. Neither group had an easy time. The difficulty of reintegration was not simply about the gap between the war experience and civilian life, though that gap was real and profound. It was also about the specific character of the Vietnam experience, its moral ambiguity, its absence of clear purpose, its systematic erasure of the distinction between combatant and civilian, its production of experiences that had no adequate language in American culture. The traditional frameworks for understanding military service, the frameworks of heroism and sacrifice, and the clear moral purpose that underwrites both, were not available to Vietnam veterans in the same way they were available to veterans of earlier conflicts. Those frameworks required a clarity about why the war had been fought that Vietnam simply did not provide. The veterans who tried to talk about what had actually happened found that there were severe limits on what they could say. The military had its institutional narrative. The anti-war movement had its narrative, which acknowledged atrocities but tended to use them primarily as evidence for the movement's political position rather than as an attempt to actually understand what had happened and why. The broader culture had very little space for accounts that were both honest about the violence and honest about the complexity of why individual soldiers had participated in it. The result was silence. Extensive, pervasive, decades-long silence about what had actually happened in Vietnam. That silence shaped the mental health crisis that followed the war home. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a recognized diagnostic category until 1980, and the recognition itself was significantly driven by the advocacy of Vietnam veterans and the psychiatrists who were trying to treat them. Before that recognition, the symptoms that are now understood as PTSD were treated in ways that generally did not help and sometimes made things considerably worse. Veterans were told to put it behind them. They were told that their problems were personal, rather than the predictable consequences of what they had been through. They were told in various ways that the experiences they were trying to describe were not the kinds of experiences that a healthy person would be unable to leave behind them. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans, which has been studied and disputed over the decades with numbers that vary considerably depending on methodology and time period, is generally understood to be substantially higher than the rate among comparable civilian populations. The precise number of Vietnam veterans who died by their own hand after returning is difficult to establish definitively, partly because the relationship between military service, combat exposure, and subsequent suicide is difficult to isolate statistically, and partly because the tracking systems for veteran health outcomes in the post-war period were inadequate to the scale of the problem. The Veterans Administration, in the years immediately after the war, was not prepared for the volume and character of the mental health needs it was being asked to address. The defoliation program, Operation Ranch Hand, which sprayed approximately 73 million liters of herbicides over the Vietnamese countryside between 1962 and 1971, represents another dimension of the war, where what was known internally did not match what was said publicly. The primary herbicide used, Agent Orange, contained dioxin as a contaminant, and concerns about the health effects of dioxin exposure were present in the scientific and military literature well before the program reached its peak scale. The manufacturers of Agent Orange, including Dow Chemical and Monsanto, had internal evidence of the compound's toxicity. The military had internal assessments of potential risks. None of this information was shared with the soldiers who handled the herbicide, who sprayed it from aircraft, who operated in areas that had been sprayed, and who had extensive dermal and respiratory exposure over years. The health consequences that followed were severe and varied. Veterans who had been exposed to Agent Orange developed cancers and other chronic diseases at elevated rates. Their children were born with birth defects at elevated rates. The Vietnamese population, both the civilian population of the South that was most heavily exposed during the spraying operations and the people who continued to live in contaminated areas for decades afterward, experienced and continues to experience health consequences that have never been fully documented or adequately acknowledged. The legal and institutional response to the Agent Orange health crisis was shaped from the beginning by the potential liability exposure of both the chemical manufacturers and the federal government. The class action lawsuit brought by veterans was settled in 1984 for $180 million, an amount that worked out to approximately $1,200 per affected veteran, a settlement that was structured in ways that prevented veterans from subsequently pursuing claims against either the manufacturers or the government. The settlement was negotiated in ways that the plaintiff's lead attorney later said he believed had involved improper judicial conduct. The veterans who received settlement payments did not receive any acknowledgement of causation, any admission that their health problems had been caused by Agent Orange exposure. The settlement brought legal closure without requiring anyone to accept responsibility for what had been done. The question of responsibility is one that the official narrative of the Vietnam War has consistently struggled to locate. The standard American accounting of the war attributes its failures to strategic miscalculation, to the inherent difficulties of counterinsurgency warfare, to the limitations of the South Vietnamese government as a partner, to the political constraints that prevented the kind of full military commitment that might theoretically have changed the outcome. This accounting locates the problem in the situation rather than in the decisions made by specific people who knew what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. It is an accounting designed to distribute responsibility so broadly that it effectively disappears. The specific decisions that determined how the war was fought and reported were made by specific people. Robert McNamara developed and championed the systems analysis approach that produced the metrics obsession and the body count culture. William Westmoreland implemented a strategy of attrition that he had significant reason to believe was failing and that he continued to support publicly long after internal evidence had accumulated that it was not achieving its stated objectives. Lyndon Johnson expanded the war through means that included deliberately misleading Congress and the American public about the circumstances of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Richard Nixon, having campaigned on a secret plan to end the war, instead expanded it geographically into Cambodia and Laos, while pursuing a policy of Vietnamization that he and Henry Kissinger understood would not produce a durable peace, but would create sufficient interval between American withdrawal and South Vietnamese collapse to make it politically manageable for his administration. The Cambodia incursion of 1970 is an instructive case in this respect. Nixon had been conducting secret bombing operations in Cambodia since the beginning of his administration, operations that were kept secret from Congress through a system of falsified reports, with bombing strikes entered in the official record as having occurred in South Vietnam. The secrecy was not primarily about operational security. It was about the political impossibility of acknowledging that American forces were conducting combat operations in a country that was officially neutral. When the ground incursion into Cambodia was announced in April 1970, it produced the most significant domestic political crisis of the war since Tet, including the Kent State shootings in which National Guard soldiers killed 4 student protesters at Ohio's Kent State University. What it did not produce was any accounting of the secret bombing that had preceded it, or the falsified records that had concealed it. The falsification of bombing records was not a peripheral anomaly. It was a systematic feature of how operations in Cambodia and Laos were conducted and documented throughout the period when those operations were officially denied. The officers who maintained the dual record-keeping system, who received orders to falsify records and carried out those orders, were participating in something that had no adequate legal or moral framework other than as a criminal conspiracy to deceive Congress. The system operated for years. It was investigated after the fact. Nobody went to prison for it. The POW and MIA issue is another area where the gap between official statements and official knowledge produced lasting damage. The question of whether American prisoners of war remained alive in Southeast Asia after the formal end of American combat involvement is one that the government has consistently answered in the negative while managing a documentary record that creates persistent questions about whether that answer was based on complete information. The DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, produced assessments in the years following the war that acknowledged the possibility of living prisoners with a frankness that was not reflected in public statements. The political and financial costs of acknowledging living prisoners, which would have required either abandoning them or reopening the conflict to recover them, were prohibitive. The answer was no. The families of missing men believed the answer was more complicated than that, and they were not entirely wrong to believe it. The economic interests that shaped American involvement in Vietnam have been discussed in various ways over the decades, but have never fully entered the mainstream accounting of why the war was fought. The strategic rationale offered publicly throughout the war was essentially the domino theory, the argument that a communist Vietnam would lead to communist dominoes falling across Southeast Asia and ultimately threaten American security interests globally. The domino theory was not believed by most of the senior officials who invoked it in public. The internal record, which includes the Pentagon Papers and subsequent declassified documents, shows that the actual strategic calculus was primarily about American credibility, about the global perception of American willingness and ability to make good on its commitments to allies and clients, rather than about the specific strategic significance of South Vietnam itself. But beneath the credibility argument, the specific shape of American involvement in Southeast Asia was also shaped by interests that were rarely stated explicitly. the rubber and mineral resources of the region, the naval access routes that ran through the South China Sea, the broader question of whether American business and financial interests in the region could be sustained in a political environment that included communist governments in mainland Southeast Asia. These interests were not the primary drivers of American policy, in the sense that they were the conscious primary reasons stated in planning documents, but they shaped the environment within which policy was made in ways that are difficult to separate cleanly from the stated strategic rationale. The Vietnamese perspective on all of this is another systematic absence from the standard American account of the war. The war that Americans fought in Vietnam was, for the Vietnamese people, a continuation of a conflict that had been ongoing in various forms for decades. The French had fought a colonial war in Indochina from 1946 to 1954 that killed approximately 400,000 Vietnamese civilians and combatants. The American war killed somewhere between 1 and 3 million Vietnamese people, military and civilian, depending on how the numbers are calculated and what populations are included. The Vietnamese countryside was transformed by bombing, by defoliation, by the destruction of villages and displacement of populations, in ways that fundamentally altered the landscape and the social fabric, in ways that outlasted the war by decades. None of this appears in the body count. The body count tracked enemy dead as a fraction of the losses actually inflicted. The larger human reality of what the war did to the Vietnamese people, North and South, was not something the reporting machinery was designed to measure, and it was not something that American strategy was designed to minimize. The civilian casualties were, in a meaningful sense, a feature of the strategy rather than a regrettable side effect. The destruction of the rural infrastructure that supported the Viet Cong, including the people who were part of that infrastructure regardless of whether they were combatants, was what a strategy of attrition in a guerrilla war actually produced when implemented at scale. The Strategic Hamlets program, which preceded the main American escalation, and was designed to separate the population from the Viet Cong by concentrating rural Vietnamese in fortified villages, destroyed the social and agricultural structures of communities that had existed in specific places for generations. People were removed from land they had farmed for their entire lives and relocated to places that had no meaning for them. The program did not produce the kind of political allegiance to the Saigon government that it was theoretically designed to produce, partly because the act of forced relocation was itself a demonstration of the government's indifference to the welfare of the people it claimed to represent. It produced resentment and in many cases increased support for the Viet Cong among people who might otherwise have been indifferent. The intelligence failures that pervaded American operations in Vietnam were connected to the same institutional structures that produced the inflated body counts and the optimistic assessments. The CIA station in Saigon produced analyses of Vietnamese political and military realities that were often considerably more accurate than the assessments coming from the military command. Those analyses were often discounted or ignored because they were inconsistent with the direction that policy had already committed to. The phenomenon of intelligence being shaped to fit policy rather than policy being shaped to fit intelligence is not unique to Vietnam, but Vietnam represents one of the most extensively documented examples of how it operates and what it costs. Sam Adams, a CIA analyst who worked on the Vietnam account, documented in careful detail the systematic underestimation of enemy strength that MRCV maintained throughout the war. His analysis, which showed that enemy forces were substantially larger than the official order of battle acknowledged, was suppressed, contested, and ultimately excluded from the National Intelligence Estimate in 1967, in ways that Adams spent much of the rest of his life documenting and protesting. The suppression was not primarily about the analytic merits of the question. It was about the political consequences of acknowledging that the enemy was larger and more capable than the official narrative required it to be. If the enemy was as large as Adams's analysis suggested, then the years of attrition had not significantly degraded enemy combat capacity, and the strategy had not been working. The analysis was therefore unacceptable, and it was made unacceptable by institutional processes that operated with their own kind of bureaucratic efficiency. The 1968 Tet Offensive was the moment when the gap between the official narrative and the reality became visible to the American public in a way that could not be immediately managed. The coordinated Viet Cong attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including the assault on the American embassy compound in Saigon, occurred in the aftermath of an extended period of official optimism. The preceding months had featured systematic public statements from both military commanders and the Johnson administration about progress in the war, about the light at the end of the tunnel, about indicators pointing toward an achievable conclusion. The images of Viet Cong fighters inside the American embassy compound, which had been described as a secure installation in the secure capital of a country where the enemy was being worn down, were not reconcilable with those statements. The Tet Offensive was, by many military measures, a defeat for the Viet Cong. The attacks failed to achieve most of their objectives. The popular uprising that the offensive was designed to trigger did not materialize. Viet Cong forces suffered enormous casualties from which the organization never fully recovered, with the North Vietnamese regular forces playing an increasingly dominant role in subsequent years. None of this was strategically irrelevant. But the political impact of Tet in the United States was not primarily about the military balance. It was about the credibility of every official statement that had been made about the war for the preceding several years. If the official assessments had been accurate, Tet could not have happened. Tet had happened. The official assessments had therefore not been accurate. This logic was simple, and it was devastating. Walter Cronkite's February 1968 editorial broadcast, in which he described the war as a stalemate and questioned whether victory was achievable, is frequently cited as a pivotal moment in the shifting of American public opinion. Lyndon Johnson reportedly said, upon watching it, that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. The significance of the broadcast was less in its content, which was an honest assessment of the military situation, than in what it represented institutionally. Cronkite was the most trusted journalist in American television. His willingness to state plainly what the official briefings had been obscuring for years meant that the official narrative had lost a significant degree of institutional support that it could not easily recover. Johnson's announcement in March 1968 that he would not seek re-election was, among other things, an acknowledgement that the credibility crisis produced by the gap between his administration's public statements and the reality of the war had made his political position untenable. It did not end the war. It did not fundamentally alter the institutional structures that had produced the misrepresentation. It transferred the problem to his successor, who was no more able to resolve the fundamental contradictions of the war than Johnson had been, though Nixon pursued his inability with different methods. The expansion of the war under Nixon, including the secret bombing campaigns and the Cambodia incursion, was justified internally by a theory of pressure that would force North Vietnam to negotiate on terms acceptable to the United States. The theory required that North Vietnam be susceptible to the kind of cost-benefit calculation that the American strategic framework assumed. The evidence that North Vietnam was not susceptible to this calculation had been accumulating for years. The level of bombing required to actually force a political settlement, if such a level existed, would have been orders of magnitude larger than anything politically sustainable. The linebacker operations of 1972, which represented the heaviest sustained bombing of the war, produced a ceasefire agreement that left North Vietnamese forces in place in the south, and that both American and North Vietnamese negotiators understood was likely a precursor to eventual communist takeover rather than a genuine resolution of the conflict. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 were sold to the American public as achieving peace with honor. The internal assessments of the agreement's durability were considerably less optimistic. Kissinger and Nixon understood that the agreement did not resolve the fundamental political question of who would govern Vietnam. It withdrew American combat forces, secured the return of prisoners of war, and established a ceasefire that nobody on either side expected to be permanent. The 2-year interval between the Accords and the fall of Saigon in April 1975 was, from the perspective of those who negotiated the agreement, roughly what had been anticipated. The fall of Saigon and the collapse of the South Vietnamese government were not surprises to the people who had been most directly involved in managing the endgame of the war. The evacuation of Saigon in April 1975, the images of helicopters on rooftops, and the desperate crowds at the embassy gates was the conclusion of a process that had been understood to be coming for years. The South Vietnamese who had worked with American forces, served in the South Vietnamese military, worked for American organizations, had been given various degrees of reassurance about American commitment to their safety that proved in the event to be inconsistent with the practical constraints of the evacuation. The number of South Vietnamese who had been promised or implied protection and who were left behind is contested and probably impossible to establish with precision. Many of them spent years in re-education camps. Some of them were executed. The accounting of who was left behind and what happened to them is another area where the official record and the reality diverge in ways that have never been fully reconciled. The focus of subsequent American attention to the fall of Saigon was primarily on the American experience of the evacuation, on the symbolic significance of the images, on the meaning of the defeat for American self-understanding. The Vietnamese, who had been part of the American project in South Vietnam for years, who had staked their lives and their families' lives on American commitment, received relatively little sustained attention in the accounting that followed. The veterans who came home from Vietnam after 1973, the men who had fought in the final years of the war, when the institutional breakdown was most severe and the absence of purpose most apparent, had a particular difficulty fitting into the cultural frameworks that were available for understanding military service. They were not greeted with hostility by most of the American public, despite the later mythology that said they were. They were more often greeted with indifference, which in some ways was more difficult. Their war had ended in a way that left almost no clear point of pride, no clear moment of achievement, no victory to point to. The framework of sacrifice for a comprehensible goal, which has historically been the framework within which military service is culturally processed in America, was not available to them in any form that felt honest. The suicide rate, the substance abuse rate, the homelessness rate, the incarceration rate, the divorce rate, all of these metrics, which were tracked with varying degrees of consistency and accuracy in the years after the war, showed Vietnam veterans suffering outcomes worse than comparable populations who had not served. These outcomes were not simply consequences of combat stress. They were also consequences of the particular character of the Vietnam experience, its ambiguity, its moral erosion, its institutional dishonesty, and the absence of any cultural framework for processing what had actually happened and why. The official history of the war that has been constructed over the decades since 1975 has engaged with these realities in partial ways. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, designed by Maya Lin and opened in 1982, represented an acknowledgement that something had been done to the men whose names it bore that required a particular kind of recognition, though the memorial's design, with its reflective black surface and its listing of names without explanation or context, communicates the acknowledgement through what it omits as much as through what it includes. It names the dead. It does not describe what they died for or what they died doing. The retrospective literature on Vietnam, which has been voluminous since the late 1970s, has produced accounts of varying honesty. The combat memoirs of men who served tell stories that the official record never contained. The investigative journalism of later decades has recovered specific incidents and institutional decisions that were suppressed at the time. The declassification of government documents has made available internal assessments that demonstrate in detail the gap between what officials knew and what they said. None of this has produced anything like a comprehensive public reckoning. The institutional structures that managed the war and produced its misrepresentations did not face any kind of systematic accountability. The men who made the decisions that determined the shape of the war and the character of the reporting continued their careers and their lives with the protection of institutional affiliation and the passage of time. The lessons that were institutionally learned from Vietnam were primarily lessons about how to manage information and public perception in future conflicts. The Powell Doctrine, which emerged partly from Colin Powell's Vietnam experience and called for overwhelming force, clear objectives, and broad public support before committing to military intervention, represents one strand of the institutional learning. The embedding of journalists with military units in subsequent wars, which gave journalists access while also giving the military significant control over what journalists could observe and report, represents another strand. The fundamental question of why the gap between official statements and operational reality had been so extreme and so sustained in Vietnam, and what institutional changes might prevent it from recurring, was never fully engaged. The answer to that question would have required confronting the degree to which the misrepresentation was not a malfunction, but a function. It was not a failure of the institutions involved. It was what those institutions produced when they were asked to manage a war that had no achievable objective, to report on a conflict whose costs could not be justified by any foreseeable outcome, and to maintain public and congressional support for a policy that its own architects believed was failing. The misrepresentation was the war's most consistent and durable product. Everything else, the bodies, the destroyed villages, the traumatized veterans, the collapsed South Vietnamese government, was subject to change and eventual conclusion. The machinery of reporting that made the war appear to be something it was not operated until the end, and in certain forms outlasted the war itself. The official casualty figures for American dead in the Vietnam War are 58, 220. These numbers are carved into the wall in Washington. They are the most specific and probably the most reliable numbers the war produced. They count only American military deaths. They do not count the Vietnamese dead on any side, the Laotian and Cambodian dead, the Americans who died in the years after the war from causes connected to their service, the South Vietnamese who died in re-education camps after the war ended, or any of the other human costs that the official accounting was not designed to capture. The 58,220 are the dead that the official record admits to having produced. They represent a fraction of what the war actually cost. The war's costs were not distributed equally. They never are. The men who served in Vietnam were disproportionately drawn from the lower and working classes, from communities where college deferments and other means of avoiding military service were less available. The affluent and the educated found ways to avoid the war that were inaccessible to the poor. This was not a secret. It was understood at the time and documented in the demographic data of the men who served. It shaped the texture of unit life in ways that interacted with all the other stresses of the experience. The men who were fighting a war they had often not chosen, for reasons they could not clearly articulate, for a cause they had reason to doubt, belonged in many cases to communities that had the least access to the cultural and institutional resources for making sense of what was happening to them. The communities they came from also had the least access to the mechanisms of accountability that might have forced a more honest accounting of the war while it was happening. The families of the dead in working-class neighborhoods did not have representation in the rooms where the decisions were made. They received the official telegram and the flag folded at the funeral and the assurance that their son had died in service to his country. They did not receive an honest explanation of why the country had sent him to the place where he died, what he had actually been asked to do there, or why the people who had sent him believed it was worth doing. The silence that surrounds what actually happened in Vietnam is maintained partly by the passage of time and partly by the difficulty of the accounting. To fully account for what was done in Vietnam requires confronting questions about institutional honesty, about the relationship between American power and American responsibility, about what it means for a democratic society to conduct a war through systematic misrepresentation of its purposes and its conduct. These are not comfortable questions. They do not have comfortable answers. They implicate not just the individuals who made specific decisions, but the broader institutional structures that enabled and sustained those decisions for more than a decade. The soldiers who were there knew most of this. not in the abstract analytical form in which it can be described at a distance of 50 years, but in the form of accumulated specific experiences that added up to a reality that the official record was organized to deny. They knew what the body counts actually represented. They knew what happened in the villages. They knew what the rotation system did to unit cohesion. They knew when the missions they were sent on had no military purpose. They knew what the drugs were about, and what the fragging was about, and what the increasingly elaborate rituals for surviving the final months of a tour were about. The careful management of risk, when risk had stopped being justified by any conceivable purpose. The specific protocols that soldiers developed to get themselves home alive from a war whose architects had stopped believing in, but had not stopped sending men to fight. They carried all of this home and found that the official narrative had no place for it. The official narrative needed the war to have been a tragedy, a case of good intentions defeated by circumstances, a conflict that was ultimately the result of miscalculation rather than something more deliberate. The soldiers' knowledge was incompatible with that narrative, and the narrative proved more durable than the knowledge. The knowledge went underground, into the particular silence of people who have experienced something they cannot communicate to people who have not experienced it, and who have learned that the attempt to communicate it produces incomprehension rather than understanding. What remained in the official record was a series of numbers, a series of dates, a series of policy decisions with their stated rationales, and the 58,220 names on the wall in Washington. The names are real. The numbers are selective. The dates mark events whose actual character is partially obscured by the language used to describe them. The policy decisions are documented in ways that foreground their stated rationales and background their actual dynamics. The war is present in the official record in the way that a shadow is present in a photograph, as an absence that defines the shape of what surrounds it. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March 1973. The last American diplomatic presence ended with the fall of Saigon in April 1975. By that point, the war that American forces had been fighting for nearly a decade had been redefined, repositioned, partially concluded, and substantially reframed so many times that the original rationale for involvement had become nearly impossible to locate beneath the accumulated layers of justification and revision. The men who had fought in its earliest years, and the men who had fought in its final years, had served in what were in some respects different wars, shaped by different strategic frameworks, different rules of engagement, different institutional cultures, and different relationships between the official narrative and operational reality. What remained constant throughout was the machinery of misrepresentation. It operated in the first advisory years, when the scale of American involvement was deliberately understated to avoid domestic political complications. It operated during the escalation, when the justifications for expanding the war were organized around an incident that had been misrepresented to Congress. It operated through the years of attrition, when the body counts climbed and the strategic situation did not measurably improve. It operated through the final years, when Vietnamization was described as a viable strategy by people who understood it as a managed withdrawal. It operated through the fall, when the collapse that had been anticipated was described in the moment as something unforeseen. The machinery did not stop when the war ended. It continued to operate in the subsequent decades, shaping how the war was taught and remembered and invoked in political debates, producing assessments of what had gone wrong that were organized to protect the institutional structures that had produced the failures, constructing a usable history from the wreckage of an unusable one. The Vietnam War is, in the official American account, a tragedy that produced important lessons about the limits of military power and the necessity of public support for military action. In the account of the people who were there, it is something else. It is the experience of serving in a war that the people who sent you knew was not going in the direction they were telling you it was going, of performing a function that the official record was systematically misrepresenting, of carrying home a knowledge that the culture had no adequate place for. 58,220 names. That is the number the official record kept. The fighting in South Vietnam continued for 2 years after the peace agreement was signed, as North Vietnamese forces and the remnants of the Saigon army contested the territory the accords had left unresolved. The South Vietnamese government kept fighting with diminishing American support until the morning of April 30, 1975, when the last helicopters lifted off the embassy roof, and by evening the North Vietnamese army was in Saigon, and the war, the American part of it, was over. It had lasted, depending on how you count, somewhere between 10 and 30 years. The reporting on it had been organized from the beginning around producing a version of events that the situation did not support. The situation did not change to fit the reporting. The reporting continued anyway, until there was nothing left to report on, and then it stopped.